Well, folks, it is 10:30, according to my clock, and it's time for Brainstorming the Human Connection, brought to you by the South Dakota Humanities Council. This is an interactive discussion. That's the main thing I want to always reiterate. And it is important to use this opportunity to talk about or get used to talking about things that maybe we are not familiar with. We hope, we intend for it to be a safe environment, no nosebleeds or punching through the screen or anything like that. Just kind of an easy conversation where we let the ideas wrestle rather than us wrestling each other. Today, we're going to be talking about a subject that probably not a lot of people know about. It's called, it's a new field of economics, relatively new field of economics called behavioral economics. And we're going to be learning about it, but also the underlying question is, how do we make decisions? Now, many of us think that, I think about a thing and then I, weigh the pros and cons, and I make a decision on X, Y, or Z. Well, it turns out that maybe making decisions are not as simple as we think. We often hold each other responsible for the decisions we make. We often say things like, well, you chose to do such and such a thing. And we hand that responsibility to the person for whatever decision they make. Now, that of course, it presupposes that we can determine what the outcome of a decision will be when the rest of the universe has something to say about it too. But that's kind of another subject. Today, we're going to be talking about what happens maybe underneath our conscious level that drives our decision. What makes us make decisions that we don't maybe know about or care about, but they're actually somehow impacting the decision. We're going to be learning about behavioral economics, but I want you to be asking yourself, how do I make decisions? And what impact does this under the hood stuff that you're going to be learning about, if you don't know it already, what impact does that have on my decisions? How are my decisions made? And how do you think you make decisions? So maybe we can start off even with a question now. Anybody have any idea about, how do you come about making decisions? Do you ever make any decisions? Yeah.
I just read something about a half an hour before we started, and I thought, how do I make decisions? And then I actually sent something to Colby. There's a research done where people make the choice between red lines and green lines, and then they are hooked up to an MRI. And they said that the brain makes a decision 11 seconds before you actually make it. And so that ties into the humanities, the book review on the seed keepers. And we were talking about traumatic or trauma following the DNA. And so that to me tied with it. It's just not learned experiences, but possibly genetics. It's transferred. They say the sins of the children will follow the biblical thing. Yeah. And so I had a whole new light on it, and I'd never considered really how I make decisions. They come so naturally to me, and I'm not afraid to make them. So it's brand new what we're learning today. Brand new thought for me.
Okay. Great. Betty, you were going to say something?
Well, I live on the line of coming from emotions, and I'm finally recognizing that, and also realizing it's not the best way to make decisions, perhaps. So I try to think about how I feel about something that I have to decide on.
Okay.
Some success, perhaps not much.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping that this discussion today will reveal one kind of the, I don't know, weaknesses of our decision-making process, because there are things happening that we don't know about, but also being aware of them, how we can say, maybe I want to think that over again, and what kind of input could we have, even if we have much less than we thought. How much can we, how much can we impact the decisions that we can make? I'm not sure. And it'll be a case by case, person by person, but I like for people to be aware of these things, even if we find out, well, it's not much I can do about it, if that is the case. But at least we're aware of the mistakes that we can make, or decisions that we make. Maybe they're mistakes, who knows? But the decisions that we make and how they impact our lives, but just as much how our expectations of others can change when we realize that they're struggling with the same things that we're struggling with. Now, I'm going to go now and I'm going to play a relatively short video that's going to kind of expose more of something that Vicki was talking about, but from the School of Behavioral Economics. You'll learn a little bit about its kind of sort of the 50,000-foot view of behavioral economics, and then we can have another discussion after that. So let me just share this screen here, and okay, let's see what happens.
Hi, this is Crash Course Economics. I'm Adrienne Hill.
And I'm Jacob Clifford. So when economists make their models, they generally assume that people are rational and predictable.
But when we look at actual human beings, it turns out that people are impulsive, short-sighted, and a lot of times just plain irrational. Look, balloons.
Today we're talking about behavioral economics and how people actually make decisions. Behavioral economics is a subfield of economics that focuses on the psychological, social, and emotional factors that influence decision-making. That's not necessarily new. In fact, our old buddy Adam Smith discussed it in the Theory of Moral Sentiments in 1759. But generations of economists chose to ignore many irrational elements of decision-making since it makes it harder to predict human behavior. But in the last few decades, behavioral economics has made a comeback. Several Nobel Prizes have been awarded to researchers that blend economics and psychology, and behavioral economics is being applied to more and more fields like marketing, finance, political science, and public policy. Now, it's important to mention that irrational human behavior doesn't negate everything you've learned here at Crash Course Economics. It just adds another layer of complexity, which is exactly what we love at Crash Course. Now, in most cases, people are irrational. When the price falls for a product, people have a tendency to buy more of that product, so the law of demand holds true. But economists also accept that there's bounded rationality. Limits on information, time, and abilities might prevent people from seeking out the best possible outcome. For example, if the price of ice cream is really low, consumers might not buy more. In fact, they might buy less if they think that that low price means that ice cream tastes horrible. Now, if that happens, then the law of demand doesn't hold true, which creates a serious problem in classical economics. I mean, it's the law of demand. You can't have a situation that breaks the law and still call it a law, right? That doesn't happen in other disciplines like physics, except it does. The Newtonian laws of physics, like gravity, hold true most of the time, but they break down at the quantum level. They explain the orbits of planets, but they have a harder time explaining the orbits of electrons. And it's the same in economics. Classical economic theory explained the big picture stuff pretty well, but there's still a lot of things about individual decision-making that we just don't fully understand.
In our ice cream example, one of the problems is lack of information. Classical economics assumes that consumers have perfect information when making choices. That is, they know or at least can quickly access information about prices and quality. But in reality, they often don't. Sure, the consumer can ask around or call their friends to see if they've tried that type of ice cream, but they're probably not going to do that. In this situation, consumers may act on the limited information they have, a suspiciously low price, which means either the ice cream is a great deal or it tastes like mayonnaise. We just don't know. Prices do send a lot of signals, and there's even science on how prices change perception. A study in California analyzed the brains of people taste testing a variety of red wines. The researchers gave participants fake prices and scanned their brains to determine the level of enjoyment. The results were surprising. When they thought the price was higher, they actually liked the wine more. This held true even when the subjects were given the exact same wine, but were told it was a different, higher priced wine. The researchers said, contrary to the basic assumptions of economics, marketing actions can successfully affect experience pleasantness by manipulating non-intrinsic attributes of goods. So once you've got a palatable Pinot Noir, you might be able to raise the price and actually raise the demand. All you have to do is change perception. The idea that perceptions and passions influence our actions also applies in finance. Many economists used to believe that assets like stocks and real estate would stay at or near their real value because cold calculating investors would buy undervalued assets and sell overvalued assets. But that doesn't explain bubbles. In real life, investors aren't always cold and calculating. They can get worked up and they're rational sometimes. This helps explain bubbles from the Dutch tulip mania of the 17th century to the 2008 financial crisis. Investors became irrationally exuberant and were driven not by logic, but by what economist John Maynard Keynes once called animal spirit. So behavioral economics doesn't blow up traditional economic theory. It just seeks to understand when and why people behave differently than economic models would suggest. Let's go to the thought bubble.
One of the most popular experiments in behavioral economics is called the ultimatum game. In this experiment, two players decide how to share a specific sum of money, let's say $100. The first player is given all the money and then is asked to propose a way of splitting it with the second player. Now, if the second player accepts the deal, both players get to keep the money. But if the second player refuses, nobody gets to keep the money. When the first player offers to split the money 50-50, the second player almost always accepts. But what happens when the first player offers an unequal split, like 80-20? Would you accept that offer? Well, it turns out the less equal offers are often rejected. Now, that doesn't seem surprising, but it directly contradicts classical economic theory. It's irrational. The rational choice would be for the second player to accept any offer, even if it's only $1. And after all, $1 is better than nothing. But human behavior is not motivated solely by gain. It's also shaped by complex ideas like fairness, injustice, and even revenge. The ultimatum game shows that people aren't always as predictable as many economists like to suggest. If people were entirely rational, they would consistently make the same decision given identical options. But sometimes people's preferences are dependent on how the options are presented. Psychologists call this type of cognitive bias the framing effect. I mean, would you rather eat beef that's 75% fat-free or 25% fat? Would you rather enter a raffle that claims 1 out of every 1,000 players is a winner, or a raffle that points out that there's going to be 999 losers? Would you support a law that's called the Improve Our Schools Act, or one that's named the Raise Our Taxes Act? Each of these scenarios can be framed in ways that influence your decision. Classical economics argues that framing should have relatively little effect on decision-making because most people are rational and intelligent. In the real world, people can be pretty irrational.
Thanks, Thought Bubble. So businesses have known about the psychology of decision-making for a long time. For example, a gym might break down its membership fee and advertise it only costs $1 a day, which seems way more affordable than $365 a year. And a TV priced at $499.99 seems like a better deal than one priced at $500. This is called psychological pricing. It can make people feel like they're getting a good deal. Interestingly, high-end retailers sometimes do the opposite. They set their prices at whole dollars, basically signaling their goods are of a higher quality than you might see at a discount store. Behavioral economists also like to talk about something called nudge theory. Nudges encourage people to act a certain way without actually changing the choices that are available to them. Fighting childhood obesity is a priority in many countries, and policymakers have suggested a whole range of solutions, everything from banning soda in schools to running media campaigns promoting healthy eating. Behavioral economists approach the problem a little differently. They wanted to see if they could get children to eat healthier by rearranging school cafeterias. They put healthier food like fruits and vegetables on eye-level shelves and less healthy foods like desserts in less convenient places. Classical economic theory suggests that this idea wouldn't work since rational people would pick the brownie. But it turns out students chose the healthier foods. Nudge theory works, and it's changing how we implement public policy. There are some issues that can be addressed best with the right type of nudge.
Let's talk about something else behavioral economists look at: risk. Let's say someone offered you 2 sealed envelopes. One has $100 and one has no dollars. You can choose an envelope, or you can take $50 cash right now. So do you take the $50 or what about $49? Now, this is unlikely to happen to you in real life, but the exercise is about your attitude towards risk. Since there's a 50-50 chance of getting $100 or nothing, the expected return or the average of the possible outcomes is $50. If you're willing to accept $50 cash to abandon the envelope, then you're risk neutral. But if you accept less than $50 just to avoid walking away with nothing, then you're risk averse. Behavioral economists have done a lot of studies about risk, in particular loss aversion, the idea that people strongly want to avoid losing. Studies show that in general, losses are more painful than gains are pleasurable. So people might choose a safe course of action, even though that's not the most logical choice. Let's say we flip a coin, and if it's heads, I give you $100, but if it's tails, you have to give me $50. Now, mathematically, you should go for it, but many people won't because they want to avoid losing.
Understanding of loss aversion can help businesses and policymakers influence decisions. For example, some grocery stores in the Washington, D.C. area tried to decrease the use of disposable plastic bags by offering 5-cent bonuses if customers brought reusable bags. The policy didn't do that much. Later, they tried a 5-cent tax on plastic bags, and this time people used fewer disposable bags. This is loss aversion at work. The pain of having to pay 5 cents per bag was greater than the benefit of receiving 5 cents per bag. Another study analyzed how loss aversion can help incentivize employees. Researchers divided workers into 3 groups. The first was a control group that wasn't given a bonus. The second group was promised a bonus at the end of the year based on meeting specific goals. Participants in the third group were given the bonus at the beginning of the year and were told that they would have to pay it back if they didn't meet specific goals. The workers in the first and second groups performed about the same, but those in the third group performed significantly better. We just hate losing.
So behavioral economics has a lot to tell us. Accounting for emotion gives us a realistic view of how people actually behave.
We might not always be the rational actors classical economists believe us to be. For years, economics has had a blind spot, but behavioral economics helps us get a better look at how we make decisions. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.
Thanks for watching Crash Course Economics. It's made with the help of all of these awesome people. You can help keep Crash Course free for everyone forever by supporting it at Patreon. Thanks for watching the FDBA.
Now I'm trying to figure out how to turn the thing off. Hold on a second. I know. I don't know. Okay, now that'll turn it off. And take that off. Okay, now we're back, or I'm back. Okay, so what's your impression? Did you learn anything new or get any different insights? Anybody?
Well, I thought that it was going to be more on the scientific side of decision-making in the brain. But I've done a little work in research and development. And, you know, I think when you take people's reactions from a survey, which apparently this is what happened, or it sounds like it was, I think it's a little different than the science part, where the decision comes from in the brain, how quickly it's available, do we have control over it, and so forth. And this was interesting, but not exactly what I thought we were discussing. This is more like statistics rather than science.
Well, you make a very good point, Vicki, and I think it's one of the points that behavioral economics is trying to address, because for years, up until behavioral economics, people thought of economics, or at least scientists in general, think of economics as kind of like not even sociology, but soft science. You know, it's like they don't prove anything. There's no science behind it. The difference is they didn't talk about the science. In this case, they talked about the results of the science. And this was not surveys. These were actually tests that they did on people, and they watched how they gave them a task and watched how they responded to tasks. They didn't put them in an MRI or anything like that. That's not in these experiments, but there are experiments in which behavioral economists do use things like MRIs and brain scans of various types to determine what are people thinking versus what do they think that they're thinking. So I didn't really want to get in under the hood in this particular program, but your observation is certainly valid. That it didn't, if you had an expectation that we were going to talk about science, which I would prefer to do, but I usually find that people's eyes glaze over pretty quickly, you know. So I thought I would do something that's that I hope is a little bit more accessible. It's all that stuff is accessible to everyone. It's just that if you've never heard it before, it can sound overwhelming, you know. At least that was my experience when I first heard stuff like this. So yes, there is science underneath it, and the whole school of behavioral economics is about testing rather than just assuming something because it sounds pretty, you know. So are there any other initial reactions to the ideas presented in that short video? Did you see anything of yourself or others in that?
I would just say one other thing that I thought it was interesting when you think about how people decide to vote and politics, because there's so much hostility in the political arena between close friends. And how do people decide to vote, I think goes along with that behavioral and the climate and the culture that they live in.
I agree, and I think I've observed that as well. I want to stretch it out to not only politics, but just public policy. You know, let's take, for example, prison systems, right? And in prison systems, we operate, and the whole justice system really, we operate on the basis that people make choices, and then we, quote, make them responsible for their choices. But if people's choices are impacted by things they're completely unfamiliar with and circumstances which they don't know how those circumstances impact them, how useful is it to hold them responsible for those kinds of decisions? And that's just prisons. Well, I'll stop there for a moment and to see if there are any reactions to that idea. Oh, by the way, if you don't feel like talking, if you're shy, you can put stuff in the chat as well. Just put your questions and or comments in the chat.
Hi, this is Deb.
Okay, Deb.
My reaction to the video was it was really informative and educational in some different ways that I wasn't aware of. But to me, I'm kind of with Vicki a little bit because it sounds more like an education in how we're being manipulated to serve someone else's goal rather than our own decision making.
Yes, it could be. It could be, and it often is, you know, as you point out. Give us some idea, Deb, of like some examples that you think how that this behavioral, the discoveries, but they're actually, as I said, marketers have known this stuff for years and they've been using it. You know, it's not like new. What's new is that they brought it into a field of into the field of economics as a whole school of economics, a way to think about economics. So the ideas aren't new; they've been used for quite a while in marketing. Can you talk a little bit about what possibilities you see in people using this kind of these kind of ideas to sell us stuff?
Well, they use several examples like ultimatum and framing, and even now, the words that I use, even describing this, the way I frame them is going to kind of elicit from you a certain response if I frame it in a certain way. So it sounds manipulative to me that I'm going to get what I want, regardless of what you really want. And that's kind of how I got it. I mean, you know, that's economics. Obviously, we want to buy something for $499 rather than $500 because it just sounds better, that $1 difference. Yeah, it's just, I don't know, it seems just kind of very dishonest and manipulative. And if you're not really aware of it, you are going to be taken. You're going to be taken by somebody who knows all this and is well versed in it. And, you know, that's how I look at it.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let me respond to this, but anybody else who has comments, hold on. I want your comments and questions. To respond to you, Deb, this goes even further than you might have thought as far as like how we use that to manipulate things. For example, if you're having a conference, if you put something warm in people's hands, they will tend to be more warm in their responses to things. Okay, now you wouldn't think a cup of coffee would have that impact, or a cup of tea would have that impact, but behavioral economists, they do actual experiments, and where they set up questions, they set up, you know, situations, they invite people in, and then they have one room where they have you know, warm coffee and stuff, and one room where they don't. They have beverages, but they're cold. And then they notice, not just in one case, but over and over, they test those things over and over, and they see that there's a tendency for people to be more open and have, let's say, more empathetic responses and engagements than if people have something cold in their hands. Now, you wouldn't think that that would make a difference in a rational world, but apparently it does. Vicky, you're gonna respond?
Did you say my name?
Yes, I saw your
Oh.
mic was off.
Oh, well, if that science is true, that our brain automatically makes a decision 11 seconds before we actually know we've made a decision, then we are not as much in control of our choices that we make. So let's go back to trauma. And it could be a happy experience too. But if we have a huge memory bank that we aren't in touch with, more and more decisions that we make will come from the unknown, is what I think.
Yes, yes, and yes, because it's not. And the surprising thing that has been found is that it's not only what's in your brain, that's a thing, but also your body holds memories, and they directly impact, especially in trauma, and they directly impact how your brain will reprocess that event. So that if you have an event where you're attacked or something and you get all tensed and stuff like that, and maybe you got touched by something or you saw something, that thing can bring back that memory. Okay.
Yes.
And so there are actually therapies now where they give people something called a beta blocker that's designed for heart patients to regulate their autonomic nervous system. That's the part of your brain that causes you to sweat or breathe quickly or slow or whatever. It's you respond, a fight or flight response. And they give people those kind of drugs, and then they talk to them about their traumatic experience. And this apparently helps not only, they started out doing it with PTSD patients, but they found it worked very well for victims like rape victims. And what it does is it allows the brain to process what happened to them in a more, in air quotes, logical way, so that their emotions are not as wrapped up in the event. And it allows them to process it as an event, almost external to themselves, knowing that it did happen to them, but they can see it more objectively. And what they find is that allows them to process it. And so, for example, in a rape victim, it's easier for them to see then that it's not their fault, right? Because they're able to process the information logically and remember what happened without the involvement of their emotions to the extent that they were, okay? So it's not just the brain that's dealing with that, even a whole body is dealing with that. Anyone else on how this behavioral economics can impact how we make decisions, or how we expect other people to make decisions?
Can I ask a question of you?
Sure.
Since you work in prison ministry, and there's a lot of statistics about repeat offenders and children of people in prison, are they doing any research on this area where poor choices are made in the prisons?
That's a tough question. One, I don't know all the research that has been done and everything, and I don't know how I would begin to do that. And if I did, I mean in terms of time, etc. But if I did do that, I'm not so sure it would be welcomed. You know, that we have the classic model, because it works for us, that people are making what they think is a logical decision when they commit a crime. We already know, just from criminology, that many people, especially those who commit violent crimes, right up until the time they commit that crime, they are sure that there's no other way. They have to do what they do. The moment they do it, suddenly everything changes and they can see their mistake, right? So it's kind of like Dan Ariely talks about this. He's a behavioral economist. And he says that it's like we have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in our head. And Mr. Hyde doesn't care what he does because he knows he's never going to get punished. Dr. Jekyll is going to get punished, because as soon as the person does this thing, whether it's a violent crime or whatever, that Mr. Hyde goes away. He's not there anymore. And Dr. Jekyll is left with the results. And I think that we know this from, like even just confessions of people who says, like, I know I shouldn't have done that. And yeah, I did it, but at the moment I was just like really mad, or I thought that this thing happened, or I thought that this person was going to hurt my child. So I figured I would shoot him first, or something like that. And the other options didn't occur to me at the time, right? And I could go on at different kinds of crimes that are committed. But in terms of the law, we exercise that as though the person was sitting coldly and rationally, right? And we even make laws with the assumptions that people act in they will act in their best interest. Behavioral economics throws that on its head, because it says, no, that would be nice if they reacted in their best interest and they weighed cost benefit. But we don't, as human beings. That's not what we do. That's not how we operate. But if you accept that we don't operate in our best interest, then it just sort of throws the whole idea of crime and punishment into a tailspin. and we don't know what to do. And we're left with kind of nothing. So we don't want to face that. We want to pretend as though the world operates as we need it to fit our theoretical model. Unfortunately, our theoretical model is not based on how we actually react. And that's what behavioral economics tries to address. Does that make any sense to you guys?
Sort of.
Sort of. Okay, what part doesn't make sense? just-
I'm not sure. I'll have to think about it. I was
Okay.
trying to track what you were saying, but some of it I was unfamiliar with, so I couldn't, I couldn't draw a conclusion to it. Sorry.
Okay. No,
I'm
no,
old.
that's
What can I
perfect.
say?
Yeah, no, that's perfectly fine. The whole part of the idea here is to introduce you to things that you may not know about, and therefore you wouldn't have thought about. So it's perfectly understandable that, not sure how I feel about that, or what I think about that, or did I miss something? Betty, did you have a response? Question, comment?
It seems to me that in at least my own case of both being raised and raising children, that some of the tactics we've employed have been to scare people into behaving well. And I think this sort of ties into how we make our decisions going forward. Does that make sense?
Yes, and it very much is addressed in various experiments in behavioral economics. The idea of scaring people, because initially, kind of like if you get startled, you can have a more predictable response than after you've had a chance to sort of retreat from it and come back. And then the problem with that approach is that the person who wants to do that thing, in other words, they are making a decision, hey, I want to do that thing that I was told not to do. They become more cunning, and they think of ways to do it. So it's like, we call it in Buddhism, we call it being honest from the outside in. In other words, we show that we like to pretend that we are honest, or we like to pretend that we're obeying the rules or doing what we should do, but that's not our intent. As opposed to being honest from the inside out, where we undergo a basic change in what our desires are and what motivates us. And then our actions follow that attitude. Okay, so there are two ways of approaching, at least two ways of approaching this. So if we expect that people will operate in their best interest, first we have to assume that they know what their best interests are, and what our idea of their best interest may not be the same as theirs. So if you say for the kid, for example, you can't get any cookies out of the cookie jar until you ask, and then if you've had one cookie in a day, you can't have two, right? So from our point of view, that's in the child's best interest. You get something, but you don't get to eat the whole thing, because one, you'll probably be sick and you won't recognize that until after you're sick. And then I'm going to be the one to have to clean it up. Plus, I don't like seeing you sick. You're my child. I love you, right? So I don't want that to happen to you. So, and you should learn some restraint. Okay. So from our point of view, putting those restrictions on the child makes perfect sense. But from the child's point of view, I just want cookies, and if I don't get to see that long-term view, if I can't project to my future self, which, by the way, few adults can do that either. If I can't project to the needs of my future self, I'm thinking only about my present self, and my present self wants the cookies now, right? And my present self does not calculate consequences. That's the whole point of do we operate in our best interest? Most of the time, we might in terms of our present interest, but in terms of our long-term interest, it's hard for us to calculate long-term interest, right? That's why people overspend on their credit cards, right? Because they see short-term interest, not the actual compounded interest and long-term interest. Does any of that make sense?
If I could just add, based on what you've just said, I'm thinking that learning as a child to be afraid covers up what might be your more clear understanding of who you are. And you just go through your life accepting what people tell you to do for fear that you'll be cut off, I think, emotionally. So, but it's everything, this is all fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
Before I raise children, I'm going to learn how to do better.
But, that's a very interesting observation, Betty. Because again, it gets to that sort of future self in terms of, do we really, if we're going to act in our best interest, how do we determine what our best interests are? And so let me throw that question out to our esteemed panel here. How do you measure, pick a thing, because different things will be different, but how do you measure what your best interests are? Whatever
Well,
decision.
let me throw reconciliation out. Seems like we're unfamiliar with reconciliation. So if you cannot talk a person out of what they don't want to be talked out of, and they have this filter up that everything that they hear and take in is only what they want to hear, and the other side is completely left out, how can you possibly, for reconciliation purposes, so that two people can talk and feel entirely different than the other one and still get their information and their feelings out without destroying the other person? So I think with our behavior and who we think we are, if we only let in what we think we should let in because that is the truth, I think that our choices that we make, our relationships that we form, who we hang out with, what we read, everything is affected. And so I think that we don't consider reconciliation and the other person's feelings. Therefore, we learn nothing about the other people. And that relates to a lot of different areas of life. Culturally too. Maybe that's off base. I don't know. What do you think?
But no, I don't think so. I'm listening, and I think. Well, I just did a presentation about less than a week ago about that subject, and it does tie into behavioral economics, and it does tie into our decision making for exactly the reason that you pointed out, Becky, is that a lot of our decisions have already been made, even though we say we have an open mind to something, okay? Because we have a need to believe certain things because we have a need to see the world in a certain way. Now, to be fair, a lot of this has to do with the fact that, let's say, we have limited processing power. Let's put it that way. Every human being has limited processing power. If we have unlimited processing power, by definition, we are gods. And so taking that we're not gods, we have some limit. Some people's limit may be more than others, but we still have limits, which means that our brains, mind, however you like to look at it, they take shortcuts and in order to cope, right? So in other words, if I give you 5 numbers to add you probably could do that. If I give you 5 numbers to add, and I tell you to, and while you're doing that, I want you to type a manuscript, it's probably going to be a little more difficult. Okay, so it's that kind of processing power that what we do is like we will focus on quickly on one thing, we do something called heuristics, where we round off things and we put it in chunks so we can think about it. So when we get to thinking about cultures, I hope I'm not making too big of a jump here, but when we think about cultures, then we like to put people in a box, because to think about every individual and process the needs of each individual, the brain just feels taxed. So in order to cope, it likes to group things. Now the grouping is usually completely not only arbitrary, but often ridiculous, so those groupings don't work, but it doesn't keep the mind from doing it, because the mind wants to simplify things so that it can feel like it can cope. So the result is that when I see one person, I want to say, square hole, square peg, kind of thing. I want to say, what are the similarities between this person, and what can I assume that I know about them so that I can carry on with them. I want to make assumptions because I know so little that I usually start off with an assumption that works only if we're willing to test the assumptions. Most of us are not, because of the thing you just said. We have a filter, and we just say, well, let's say I'm a white supremacist or a Black supremacist, whatever kind of supremacist, and I have a framework in how I think about people and the categories that they are in. So when I see a person do something they're not supposed to do that because they don't belong in, those kind of people don't belong in that box, right? Then I have a certain sense of uneasiness because my framework for how the world works has broken down. That's why a lot of people, even if they have money, if they don't fit in a box, they don't buy a certain kind of car, because they know that they're going to get more tickets, because some people don't think that they should be driving a nice car. Right? Those people are not supposed to have a nice house. Those people are not supposed to be able to, let's say, invent something. So for a long time, some people weren't able to get patents because it was thought that they couldn't have invented it, because those kind of people, they don't have intelligence. So how could they invent something like this? He must have stolen it, right? It took years before the patent office came around and said, well, I guess everybody could have a patent, So people have a way of, like, again, the decisions is made because they need to feel at peace with how their view of the world works. And if they so in a sense, their decision has already been made. So they're not really dealing with the real issue. Is that too much information, or did I
No, that's good.
explain it? I'm trying to be more cognizant about giving too much information, because I usually come about an idea by looking at a lot of different angles of something. So when I'm talking to people about something, I have this tendency to try to give them at least half of the things that I explored to come to that conclusion. And often it has the opposite effect. So I'm trying to adjust.
No, that was good. I understood everything.
Okay.
I do think I have a little humor at my own. I imagine other people do it. But some people, let's say, will drive an old car just to fool people when they have a lot of money. So what they know that everybody thinks a certain way, let's say a red Mercedes convertible or black. I mean, that is driven in, say, in California, in my neighborhood. It could be, a Lamborghini. And what we think about that and what category we put them in. But other people have a sense of humor about that and will drive an old car and wear old clothes. Not too many, but to me, that's humor. As to the people they run into, they sort of go incognito. And I just happen to think that's funny. No?
I was going to say, you should seek help. No, that's, I think I've seen that in lots of cases. I've had mentors who operate exactly in that way. They were incredibly wealthy people, but if you saw them on the street, you want to give them a quarter, because they realize, like, one, I don't want people to decide that they want to talk to me or not talk to me based on what they think I have. I don't want people to evaluate me, especially people I don't even know. I don't deal with them. So I want them to just treat me just like I want them to treat the guy down the street, who actually doesn't have anything. I want them to treat me just like that, because that's the honest them, not transactional, like what can you do for me? I don't want to be, as they pointed out, I don't want to have people like that around me. So I'll address in a way that if you accept everybody, you're my people. If you want to decide that you don't like this guy because he doesn't wear this kind of clothes or something like that, I don't want you around me. And so if I dress in a certain way, I won't have to exclude you. You will exclude yourself. So it's much more efficient. So I know people like that. I've been around people like that for a good part of my life. So behavioral economics. Any other way that we can see how our faulty decision-making processes can affect our lives?
Well, maybe this is appropriate. I keep having this thought. The PBS show, Keeping Up Appearances?
No.
Well, they're two sisters. One is serves tea and bone china in the afternoon. And the other one is heavy, overweight. Her husband drinks beer. The house is a mess. And just looking at the two of them, but the keeping up appearances is what people often do if they present themselves in a certain way, so that you think that they're more knowledgeable. They have a clean house. They have a stable life when the marriage is really in ruins. And so I think that keeping up appearances is very common in our society. And I think we do judge people. If you look at advertising, when you talk about economics, look at the cosmetic industry, the clothing industry, the car industry. That's all about keeping up appearances. And that lives and breathes so well. I mean, it almost takes over our society, I think, more so in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, and the bigger cities. And that competitiveness is really breaking our society. As you said, everybody puts everything on the credit card. We live on credit. So that's a problem in our society.
Excellent. Thank you. Anyone else have any additions to this conversation? Well, let me introduce our kind of final thing here, because we're getting down. We got about 6 more minutes left here. In our personal lives, if we start to understand that there are things underneath that drive underneath our consciousness, that drives our decisions. And we start to understand that, as Deb pointed out earlier, that just the way we frame things and the words that we say how we ask a question, the words that we use to ask a question will elicit one kind of response versus another. How we say something and how we explain something versus one way versus another will impact how people hear what we have to say and how they respond to what we say. How will that affect our interactive relations, our interpersonal relationships with other people? How will that impact even like our jobs, our families, and stuff like that? What would be the takeaway for how we might use that information? Anybody? Otherwise, this will be the Lawrence and Vicky show. Well,
Well, I'll just add something at this particular point. I find it very difficult to know that I'm being recorded and anybody can see it on the internet at any time. And sometimes I have to step back because it's a little intimidating for me to speak what I think and feel on a recording that will last forever. And I think that other people who are not showing their faces or not speaking up have that same fear. I don't know how we can break that. Sometimes I feel like, oh, I shouldn't have said that.
Yeah. Well, that is a valid, certainly a valid point of view, and let me acknowledge that I feel that it's valid. Not that I'm making it valid, but I agree with that point of view. I'm hoping that in this process that we give people license to say, I believe this, because what makes my ideas less important and less valid than yours? And so the whole point of creating this kind of format is to say, your ideas count. I'm just acting as a kind of a catalyst. I may say things that I, in fact, don't fully believe, or maybe not at all, as a way to say, look, this thing should be talked about. This idea should be brought. And we can work out ideas. It's the ideas that are struggling. We hope that's the point of it, is to have the ideas struggle, not us. I will say one of the reasons I don't worry about it is because the me that you are seeing today is not going to be the me that's 10 minutes or 1 week or 1 year from now. I'm in a constant state of change. I change my ideas all the time. So other people may say, oh, 10 years ago, you said that. Yeah, 10 years ago, Lawrence said that. That is not the today Lawrence. And if I have not grown in 10 years, that's an issue. If I have not changed in 10 years, but almost by definition, I'm not a living organism, because living organisms change, right? That means I'm not even alive. So I'm hoping one of the objectives of a program like this is to start to give people license to say, I believe this. And if you show me something different, okay, I can handle that. But at this point today, these are the questions I have. And even if you don't have a comment or like a position that you're going to have, you can have a question. What is the question that's invalid today and invalid 10 years ago? What question is invalid? If you don't understand something, you simply don't understand it. If you disagree with something, you simply disagree with something. Hopefully the rest of the world will evolve to the point that they recognize that, one, based on the fact that you have different ways that you see something, you're going to have different points of view. The example I like to give since we're down to our last few minutes, the example I like to give is that if we are climbing a mountain, and I have walked up pretty high mountains, I won't say climbing because that hanging on the rope, that's not my thing. But walking around, one of the things I notice is that as I'm going up the mountain, there are things that I can see and points of view I could not have had at the base of the mountain. I could not have imagined how things would look as I get up a mountain. If you've ever just driven down a road, the view that you have driving down the road is completely different than when you're driving back. And if you try to navigate, looking in your rearview mirror, you're going to run off the road and run into something. You have to be looking, what are you looking? Where am I going? And then the stuff that's behind, it's behind. Other people may have their opinions. That's just theirs, right? And you have your opinion and the thing that you have is valid for you at that point. And as long as you're open to like, oh, you give me new information, you know, if you show me something different, then I can think about that thing different. But as long as I only have this experience and this life that I have, I can't be anything more. So that'll have to wrap it up, you know, for this week. We hope that you guys will join us next week for another conversation, and bring some questions, bring some comments, and try it. See if any warts break out or nosebleeds or anything like that. I think you can handle it. Goodbye.